Hello and a big welcome to the Winning Mentality podcast. This is a show dedicated to getting the stories behind sporting success, the why and the how of winning. I'm your host, Charlie Bosco. I'm a professional sports broadcaster and author, and frankly, a sports geek, but hey, that's the point, right? I'm going to talk to athletes, coaches, psychologists, journalists, anyone who has an inside view of success in sport. I'll be speaking to some people that are world famous and others who quietly get on with a seemingly normal life while performing at a world-class level in their chosen sports just in their free time. A new episode will be released every Sunday, and each one will have an in-depth conversation with a guest trying to understand how they've achieved what they have. The number of sports I've covered in the interviews already recorded has been incredibly diverse, and that will continue to be the case as time goes by. And best of all, I guarantee you now, this podcast will always be free. You'll never have to pay to hear these interviews. Ultimately, I want to know what separates those at the top of their sport from, well, us. Why is Roger Federer, with $500 million in the bank, a wonderful family, and the greatest career in men's tennis history, currently sitting in his Zurich mansion, training for yet another grueling competition? What makes Tom Brady, rich beyond his wildest dreams and with 5 Super Bowl rings on his fingers, answer the question, which is your favourite Super Bowl win, with the next one? How does a rugby player, under the glare of the lights and with 80,000 people watching, calmly kick an oval ball through posts 50 metres away? When a free solo rock climber is 1,000 feet in the air with only the strength in their fingers and the friction in their shoes, keeping them from certain death, how do they control their mind and make it perform at its best? Beyond the athletes, I'll speak to coaches and psychologists too. How do you create a winning mentality in your team? What do you do when you've created that and then the team loses a game or a championship? What can you do to keep your team challenged, motivated, and on the right course, especially when you've already achieved success? What coaching methods are currently being developed that might one day transform our understanding of how human beings learn? I'll also be chatting to journalists, the people with the best seat in the house. Can they see patterns between successful athletes? What do they think separates the winners from the also-rans? Sometimes the people I speak to will be little known to the general public, but have an incredible story to tell. Many of my guests have had to face extraordinary adversity, but have managed to achieve incredible things against the odds. There are some people I'll interview simply because they have a world-class attitude, and I want to know where it comes from and how it manifests itself in their life. The handful of conversations I've already had, and which I'll be releasing in the next few weeks, have been varied, and none have worked out how I expected them to, but that's the nature of good conversation. It takes you to a place you never thought you'd go. Guests have made an aside or a quick comment here and there, which I've then followed up on, and we've suddenly opened up a whole new topic. I can't promise you what I'll talk about with each guest, but I can promise you that if you like sports and you are interested in how success happens, you will enjoy these conversations. If you want to support the show, then subscribe on iTunes, share and leave reviews and comments. There's also an Instagram page for the show, so give us a follow at the Winning Mentality Podcast. My first guest is a sports psychologist, author and speaker who uses his vast knowledge and experience to make teams and organisations create a culture of high performance. Professor Damian Hughes has worked at Manchester United under the greatest soccer coach in history, Sir Alex Ferguson. He's been on the coaching staff for Great Britain Rugby League and the Scottish Rugby Union team. He's also helped countless individuals, businesses and organisations through his simple, common sense-based approach to improving culture, which is centred around him changing values, behaviours and tendencies. During the interview, we talked about, amongst other things, the importance of simplicity, how to develop a winning culture, what roles motivation and leadership play in teams, and what the average person in the street can do to improve their mental game. Damian tells us what he's observed from being inside successful sports teams, but also how he's visited other teams around the world to try and figure out their methods. Did you know, for example, that when Pep Guardiola took over as manager of FC Barcelona, he hired a water polo player who knew nothing about soccer to create the culture he required? That and other such gems were why this interview could have been an awful lot longer, and I'm hoping it's just the first of many such conversations with Damian. Damian, welcome to The Winning Mentality. Absolute pleasure to have you here.
Oh no, it's my honour. It's a real honour to be asked, Charlie, so thank you for the invitation to come along. I'm looking forward to it.
And I want to start by talking about a bit of a pet theme of mine, and I know it's something that you are quite big on, simplicity.
Yep.
And there's the famous old adage, simplify, simplify, simplify. And Ralph Waldo Emerson replied, one simplify would have done.
Yep.
And that seems to summarise perhaps your approach to things.
Yeah, I think it is. I think in a world of noise, a world of constant information, the ability to simplify your message is absolutely critical. I mean, there's all kinds of stats that are worth thinking about in terms of the world that we live in. So in an average hour, we get social media requests around 37 times during that hour that try to distract us away from what we're doing. And we know that if you allow yourself to get tripped up just one of those 37 times, it takes you on average about 22 minutes to get your levels of concentration back to where you originally started from.
Is that because one distraction leads to another?
Yeah, it's almost like you go down the rabbit hole that then takes you, so you click on one link that leads you to another link that is designed to entice you to another link. So it can often, in that world of noise, like I say, just the ability to hone a message and say, this is the most important point I want to get across, is critical, whether that's to coaches, whether that's to business leaders, educationalists, it doesn't matter. I mean, I remember there was a great example that when I first started coaching, when I was a young lad, I did some work for Manchester United. And I remember on the first day, there was one of the coaches did a bit of an induction for us. And he used a really simple example. He said, you're all decent coaches technically, because you wouldn't be where you are. He said, but you fail on one thing, and that's your ability to communicate simply. And he used this really lovely exercise with us where he took a tennis ball and threw it. He said, catch it. And then when you caught it, he said, how do you find it? And it was quite easy to do. It's a simple task. He said, right, catch two. And you could catch two, but you had to concentrate a bit harder. Then when he threw three, and then he threw four, and in the final one, he threw 5 tennis balls. And the reality is, by the time you've thrown 5 tennis balls, you struggle to catch 1 or 2. And his point was, he said, that's how most people coach. They think coaching is about how many balls you can throw at people, when the reality is the best coaches understand how many balls can you catch. So what's the most important message you can take on board? What's the most simple? So how do you articulate that in the simplest way? So it's not about how many you can deliver, it's how many the person can receive.
It's an interesting coincidence, actually. We're currently sitting in the Pullman Hotel on Euston Road in the middle of London in the UK. And just before you arrived, I was drinking a coffee in the St. Pancras Hotel a couple of 100 metres away.
Yep.
And there was some guy inducting another guy who I suspect was a new employee to his company. And they were there the whole time I was there. It was about an hour and a half. And he just talked the whole time. And you can see the guy he was talking to initially was hanging off every word. He's making notes, taking it all in.
Yeah.
But an hour and a half later, every time someone new walked in the bar, he looked at them, he was distracted,
Sure.
He kept glancing at his phone. You just can't take that volume of information in. And it's just about paring it down, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky. So my background is I'm from a sporting background myself. So my dad was a boxing coach. So I grew up in boxing gyms all my life and sort of going around and meeting elite boxing coaches and things like that. And the reason I say I'm lucky is that in boxing, you get 60 seconds in between rounds to deliver your message. So you can't go in and talk for the full 60 seconds and deliver a message to a boxer that's fatigued, that is, battling nerves, you've got the other guy coming at you. You need to be able to hone your message down to just one simple point to get it across so they can do something with it. So the question is always, when you deliver your message, what do you want people to do with that information?
And I remember reading in your book as well an example where you said that it was your job to convey messages from a rugby coach to the players, and you're not a rugby expert, and that forced him to simplify the message.
Yeah, we did it. So I worked in rugby league for a number of years, and I know nothing about the sport, but I wasn't employed to come up with any knowledge about the sport. But we were in Australia at a big tournament where the coach decided in conversation that, and it was almost as a discipline for himself, that he was going to sit in the stands and watch the game, and he was going to convey the most important information to me via headphones, and I had to pass it on to the people running on the field. And what was really good about it was he couldn't use jargon because I didn't understand the jargon. He couldn't give me too technical information because I didn't have the bandwidth to understand what he was saying to pass it on. And over time, we got into the habit where he would just give me really simple messages that I could, as a player's ran past, just communicate to it. And I often think that that was a really good discipline for me and for him. And I often think that with coaches and say to them, how would you communicate if you were telling a 6-year-old child what it was that you wanted to get across?
Do you think that in a way, you not being an expert is quite beneficial almost? Because if a player makes a mistake, the coaches might look at the technical error, whereas you might study why he did it. Is he been asked to do too much and he got confused? Or look at the root cause of why the mistake was made rather than the technicality of the mistake?
That's a brilliant question, Charlie, and I think that does play to my strengths, that I don't go in with too much baggage in the sports that I'm working in. So I'm not there to offer an opinion on whether that tackle was technically correct. My job is to look at the behaviour and the environment around it. So I'll give you an example. I did some work a few years ago with a Premier League team, and one of my pet hates is when you see players berating each other of their teammates, because in a cohesive team, that really isn't going to facilitate better performance if it keeps happening. And we had one issue where there was a player running through on goal, and he has a shot, and the shot goes wide. Now, that's a technical issue. The coaches can deal with that. Was his decision-making right? Was his technique right? That's a different issue than what I need to deal with. My issue is the guy that ran alongside him that then started shouting and screaming at him. So when I sat down with the player, I said, what were you doing there? And at first he said, I was trying to tell him that he should have passed me the ball. And I said, but you did it for 20 seconds. That conversation lasted for over 20 seconds. We timed it. And you were screaming at him. You turned around. And the long and short of it was, the player eventually admitted that he wasn't letting his teammate know. He was letting everybody in the stadium know that he'd made a mistake that he wouldn't have made himself. Now, that's a different issue there. So we could deal with it in terms of the behaviour rather than, say, the technical elements that maybe coaches more steeped in the sport would focus on.
So when you get brought into a sports team, what's the brief normally? Do they just tell you to walk around and look what's going on for a week? Are you observing the players? Are you doing tests with the players? How does it normally work if you're employed by a sports team to try and improve their psychology?
It often depends on the context, if I'm honest. So I've gone and worked with some teams where they've been very much in crisis mode. So they're facing relegation, and it's about how do you help the coaches arrest the decline and do something around that. Some coaches I've been lucky enough to work with that have gone in to build a culture, to go and work with them and sort of and build a culture almost from scratch. I've worked with other coaches where it's very much around just working with the coaches, and that's almost my preferred style. So the best way to describe it is that I like to be another set of eyes and ears for the coaches to help them. The coaches are the ones with the real credibility because they pick the team, they make the decisions. So my job is to almost equip them with the information that helps them create a high-performing team. So a lot of my brief is often to look at it through a behavioural lens. I'm not looking at it from a technical lens. I'm not looking at it from a physical lens or a personality lens. It's about the behaviours within that culture and helping them understand, is that message being understood, or are there certain behaviours that are unhelpful to what they want to do, if that makes sense. So it's very much to be another set of eyes and ears to support the coaches.
That's one thing that really comes across in your book, actually, is that there's a huge difference between knowing the answer and being able to convey it. In a way, the coaches almost know too much, and therefore they give the players too much.
It is the case. I mean, to be a coach at an elite level, you are an expert. You know, there's no doubt about that. You're an expert. But what's interesting is that a lot of coaching programs, same as a lot of university programs, you learn the subject knowledge. What very rarely gets taught is how do you then communicate that subject knowledge? So that can often be the case where we either overcomplicate it, or coaches can talk for too long, or they can overload players. So a lot of what I enjoy doing is working with coaches. It's very much about taking their messages and being able to communicate them in a way that people can understand and therefore do something with it.
Well, we don't want to give too much of your method away in case people take your job. But you talk a lot about getting to the core and then using the 5 steps to facilitate it. Can you give us a quick rundown of the 5 steps, STEPS?
Yeah, what I did was I spent 3 years traveling around the world for a book that I did, where I went and met some of the world's leading sports coaches from a whole range of different disciplines. And some of them I worked with, some of them I just observed, some of them I interviewed. But what I was looking for is, what do they all have in common? So how do they get players to listen to them? How do they get players to work cohesively? How do they get players to cope when they come under intense pressure? And all the sort of challenges that are unique, not just unique to coaches, probably to anyone that tries to lead any group of people. And what I found, I distilled from that, was there was 5 things that they all pretty much had in common. And that's what the acronym I used was the steps. So the first one that they do is, and we spoke about it a bit already, is the simplicity. So they didn't overload. So whenever they did a session, they were really clear about the one message that they wanted to get across. So some of the examples I can mention about that tennis ball example there, but you go into any high-performing culture and you'll find that they're focused on just one simple message. The T part of it was about getting people to think for themselves. So what I found with a lot of these coaches were that they didn't necessarily worry so much about the information they were going to impart. They were really focused on creating an environment where people could ask questions, because that's where they saw the real value of a coach's job was. Because when people feel safe enough to put their hand up and ask a question, that's where as a coach you can go and tailor your impact and go and deliver what they need and plug those gaps in the knowledge. The E part of it was very much around emotional intelligence, that I've yet to meet an elite coach that doesn't possess high levels of emotional intelligence. Now, I know that's one of these buzzwords, a bit of jargon that gets bandied around, but effectively it's just about making people feel safe, making people feel valued, making people feel secure and trusted is the essence of what they do. The P bit is about practicality. So it's about stripping it of any jargon. So not talking in industry-specific terms, because what that makes an assumption of is that everybody understands it. So, but if you speak a language that's accessible and practical, you make sure that everybody is on board with it. And then the final S in it was about just telling great stories. So we know that if you tell somebody a story, so you can get your coaching point across, but it's shrouded in the detail that means it will get lodged in their mind and they can easily recall it and go back to access it. So what I found is that these coaches were almost great storytellers of passing on anecdotes and little examples to their players that really made their coaching message land that much deeper.
And one thing that seems to also be a common thread, certainly from an outsider, you might correct me, and it's a word you've used a couple of times already, is culture. Great teams have a great culture. And you worked at one of the best of all time, Manchester United, when Sir Alex Ferguson was there.
Culture is one of these things that the essence is it's how people behave when they come into that environment. So the example I mentioned growing up in a boxing gym is probably really pertinent. That my dad founded a boxing gym in the city of Manchester, and it's based in Europe's 3rd poorest district. So I'll give you an idea of the sort of social issues that a lot of our members came from, kids from really quite underprivileged environments. But one of the things that always stuck in my mind was that there was no bad language allowed. So these kids could F and blind with the best of them. But when they came into that environment, they would never use any bad language. And if they did, they'd immediately, without even being asked, they'd get down and do 10 press-ups whenever they used a swear word. And the reason we did that was because the message we were getting across to the kids was, that's about a lack of discipline. And a lack of discipline If you can't think of anything better to say other than an F word, that tells us that you lack discipline. And in the boxing ring, if you lack discipline, you're likely to become wild and reckless and get yourself hurt. So that gives you an idea that these kids, as soon as they stepped over the threshold of going outside of the gym, would start effing and blinding again. And it was a really interesting example to me of, this is quite powerful stuff. So all the research behind it says investing in culture is a competitive advantage in whatever we do. I mean, there's some research that says cultures that were like, the phrase I'm going to use here, and I'll explain more in a minute, is a commitment culture, tends to be around 22% more effective than other cultures. And what a commitment culture is you have a really clearly defined set of behaviours that people are really clear about. This is what you have to do within our environment. And then you almost have to drive them enough that there's an effect that I describe as the FIFO effect kicks in. People can either choose to fit into that culture, or they can find a way out. There's a less polite way, or they can find a way out and go somewhere else. So that's really where, I mean, that's my background in very much around creating organisational psychology that creates high-performing cultures and working with coaches to do precisely that.
I suppose there isn't really a short answer to this, and if there was, you'd probably be a multimillionaire. But
yeah,
what is the basic mechanisms for creating a culture? Is it getting the right people in the room to start with? Is it coaches empowering players? Is there not a one-size-fits-all, but one common theme to create that culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. The best way I would describe a culture is it's like an ecosystem, that there is no one silver bullet that says if you do this, this makes a culture happen. But there are a number of factors that if you take one of them away, the culture will be less for it, if that makes sense. So the first thing is you need to have a really clearly defined set of behaviours. This is the way we do things. So I've just finished a book that comes out this summer looking at how you do this. And the example I used was I went and looked at FC Barcelona, because they're an organisation that have defied the footballing norm. So most teams will have a 4-year cycle of success, and they've had a 10-year cycle. So my interest was, how did they do that? And speaking to the guys behind it, they very clearly identified that culture was a competitive advantage for them. There's a lovely quote. I interviewed a guy called Cheeky Begiristain, that's now is the director of football at Manchester City. But when he was there, he gave me a lovely phrase. He said, talent will get you into our dressing room, but your behaviour decides if we keep you there. So we'll get talented players, but then we're really clear about how you have to behave when you come into our environment. And they had 3 really clearly defined behaviours. The first one was humility. They say you might be the most talented player in the world, but if you're not humble, you can't learn, and therefore you can't get better. The second behaviour was hard work, that you have to still invest in your talent, however good you are. And then the third one was you put the team above your own self-interest. So what they did to drive these behaviours, it became really interesting. So when they appointed Guardiola, one of Guardiola's first appointments was a guy called Manel Estiart. Now, we were talking about me having a lack of knowledge about some of the sports I go into. Manel Estiart is a former water polo player, never been involved in professional football, but he was friends with Guardiola, and Guardiola brought him in to look at human behaviour. So one of the things that he used to do was, he used to sit on the bench during a game and watch the substitutes. And what he was looking for was, when Barcelona had a chance that maybe went wide, who were the players that jumped up in empathy, and who were the ones that sat there and didn't react? Because what he identified with that is, the ones that didn't react were sulking. When they did it sustainably, they were sulking because they weren't in the team. Now, if you're clear that one of the behaviours is you put the team above your own self-interest, sulking on the bench because you haven't been picked doesn't become an acceptable way of behaving. And therefore, there's a famous example in his first season. Guardiola estimates that he removed 4 of those players that were consistent in that behaviour. So that's the FIFO effect. You fit into this, or you find a way out and go somewhere else to do it. So behaviours is really key, first of all. Another way is that people often, we get involved. I think professional sport at the moment now has this cult of leadership. So we almost create idols out of our coaches like Mourinho or Guardiola or Conte, and we like the fact that we can refer to them as being seminal figures means that I think we overestimate the importance they have. There's a couple of economists, I mean Simon Cooper was one of them, but there was a Dutch economist that looked at the role of a head coach in creating a culture. And he estimates a coach will account for about 10% of the team's performance, no more and no less. It's around 10%. The metaphor he uses is, it's probably like talking about the prime minister of a country. So they're the most powerful individual, but they won't make or break a country. So if Theresa May came out and said something that affected the markets would decline, but they wouldn't go bust, if that makes sense. And that's probably where, when you think about that as a coach, coaches play a huge part in role modelling the behaviours. So the Guardiola example is really interesting. So he was a Catalan himself. So some of his examples about humility were that he would go and meet other coaches around the world. So he had the humility to go and accept that he didn't necessarily know. His work ethic was second to none. Like his players would recognise he was always first in, last out. The stuff around putting the team first, there was a lovely story about him where he got a contract early on in his Barcelona career with Sabadell Bank, a Catalan bank, to go and do a series of leadership talks. And he got quite a lucrative contract for doing it, and he took it, and it attracted quite a lot of flack from the Catalan press. But what he never told anybody was that the money he got for doing these talks, he distributed to all his support staff and backroom staff. So he was very much role modelling the behaviour, putting the team above his own self-interest, that he was trying to say, I'm no good if you're no good. So that's another factor. Another factor is that you create what the phrase I use is cultural architects. You create players that take responsibility for that culture. So if they see behaviours that are incongruent with what the culture stands for, they will address it there and then. So they deal with it with each other. So you look at somewhere like Barcelona, and any successful culture, you tend to get guys that have been inculcated in that culture for a long time. So they had this sense of identity. If you came through the Barcelona Academy at La Masia, you came with a sense of identity of, this is what we do. So I've got some really lovely examples I use with people where there's a brilliant game against Real Numancia where Barcelona are beating them 5-0. They end up winning 7-0. But after the fifth goal, one of the players, Thiago, runs away and does this samba dance with the Brazilian fullback Alves. And while they're doing this samba dance together, it's a pre-rehearsed dance, Puyol, the captain, runs over and stops the dance while they're doing it and ushers them back to the halfway line. After the game, Puyol comes out and issues an apology to the opposition. And he comes out and says, we wanted to beat you, but we weren't intending to humiliate you. We're better than that. Which is almost like an embodiment of what humility is all about. We wanted to win, but we weren't in the habit of making you look silly by doing a dance like that in the corner. So you need your cultural architects, the guys that embody what you're about, to come to the fore. Another part of the ecosystem is you need to then get habits that reinforce the behaviour. So there's a couple of examples from Barcelona. So they had two things that they said, if we do this regularly, we will be more successful than not. So one of them is they had what they call the 5-second rule. So you win the ball back in the first 5 seconds. So if you lose the ball, the opposition are more likely to give it away in the first 5 seconds that they get it. So they had a habit that said, as soon as the opposition get the ball, you press really with high intensity for 5 seconds to try and force a mistake.
When we say press, we're referring to, for non-soccer fans, we're referring to instantly charging to the nearest man who might have the ball, already has the ball.
Yeah, sorry, I should have clarified that. So it's the idea that you will chase after the ball, you will go nearest your man, but everybody presses and goes after it with the same intensity. If you don't win it in that first 5 seconds, you then retreat and just defend. The other habit they had was that if you keep the ball for 70% of the time, you will beat the opposition just due to exhaustion. So all of their training and their daily methods were about quick intensity and about keeping possession. So all their habits, their daily behaviours, were all designed to reinforce the culture that they were trying to create. So I mean, there's other factors, but I think what I hope that gives is a flavour of the varied factors that have to go into creating a culture. There's no one single silver bullet. It's a whole series of different interventions that are required.
One thing that strikes me, actually, you talk about the cultural architects, Carlos Puyol at Barcelona being one of them.
Yeah.
They seem to have this extraordinary inherent motivation. And I think motivation is something that is not that well understood, certainly not by the layman.
Yeah.
And I remember Clive Woodward, who coached the England rugby team to the 2003 World Cup win, saying he thought motivation was nonsense. Because if you have the right people in the room to start with, they don't need to be motivated. You don't need to motivate Carlos Puyol. You don't need to motivate Martin Johnson, who was the captain of that 2003 Rugby World Cup winning team. Do you think that motivation is just inherent in each person?
I think motivation's... I mean, if you look at the etymology of the word, this is where it gets interesting. Motivation says, why do you move from A to B? So why do you do anything? We all have to have a motivation to get up in the morning, because the act of getting up is true to the etymology of the word. What I think is that, so people think about, like people sometimes ask me, do you motivate the teams you work with? They say, no, they'd laugh at you if you're going in trying to give them some rabble-rousing speech. Like, the guys are, Clive Woodward's right in terms of anybody that is there possesses a high level of internal motivation.
You wouldn't be playing for England if you didn't have that, yeah.
100%, they wouldn't be there, yeah. But then what becomes interesting is, what drives you? And there's three effective reasons why we do anything, why we move from A to B. The first reason is we do things through desperation. We do it because we've got to do it. I have to do this. And it's that idea, it comes very much from that sense of desperation. The other rationale we use is we do it through rationalization. We say, I do this because I should do it. It's where my talents lie. It's where I'll probably get the best return on my investment for doing that. The third reason is you do it through inspiration, just because I really want to do it. But I think the most sustainable one that will see you through the bad times, the difficult bits, will always be inspiration, because you've chosen to do it. It's because you really want to. So you did it through a sense of inspiration because you really wanted to do it. It was where you felt you belonged. Yeah,
there's an interesting story, actually. I remember Tana Umaga, the former captain of the All Blacks, apparently said to Graham Hendry, the former coach of the All Blacks, about a year into Graham Hendry's reign, who are these pre-game speeches for? Because they're not helping us. And Graham Hendry said at the time he was absolutely heartbroken, because he was thinking all week, I'm gonna be Winston Churchill in the dressing room. And Tana Umaga said that 10 minutes before we go out, we don't need to hear from you.
And I think that's a really powerful point, because if you're having to fire somebody up before a big game, you should be asking some serious questions. What have you not done in training that would make them feel well equipped to go and do it? At that time, either get out of the way, or you're calming them down and making sure that they're going in with cool, collected heads. So I think there's a perception from outside, and I do understand it, that it is all about giving Churchillian speeches and getting people bouncing off walls and things like that. The reality is these are guys that, if you've done your job in the culture you've created and in the training sessions, they know what they're doing. You almost just have to get out of the way and trust that they can go and do it.
But even within top sports people, there are the people there's a pundit who refers to it as the rarefied air, the Tom Brady, Roger Federer. They just seem to have another level of motivation. They're both the best of all time at what they do. They're both rich beyond anyone's imagination. And yet they just keep coming back for more.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into what makes them, the Tiger Woods, Roger Federer, Tom Brady's of the world, tick?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really lucky. I did a couple of biographies a few years ago of a couple of elite boxers. There was two guys. One was Thomas the Hitman Hearns, and the other one was Marvelous Marvin Hagler. And I did the biographies on both of them. I was lucky enough to go and meet them and understand a little bit more about them. I mean, both of them were unparalleled greats in terms of in their sport. And I think what drove them was it was so much about the intrinsic stuff. It was never about the material possessions. It wasn't about the size of their house or the amount of money in the bank account. I think they're important to a degree, don't get me wrong, but it then became something around just pushing themselves to see just how far they could go. The competition was with themselves, not externally, if that makes sense. It was very much around, what else can I do with this?
And you've worked with, in my humble opinion, the best British coach of all time, in Sir Alex Ferguson. And I don't want to dwell too much on individual examples, but he was famous for getting into the training ground at, was it 6 a.m? He was always at his desk.
Yeah. I mean, there's all the stories about Ferguson, about the work ethic. I think some of that comes back to being true to your own values. And I know values is one of these sort of buzzwords, but it's very much around, who are you? When you're at your very best, how do you define yourself? And I think in somebody like Ferguson's point of view, I think that work ethic was something that he grew up with in Govan, that he saw from his childhood. That idea of being loyal to your teammates and people that have supported you was another value from him. And I think, again, even in his case, it was about just being true to yourself. He just happened to work in a unique industry. But I think the big thing about him was he was a bloke that was just incredibly true to his own values.
And I remember hearing you being interviewed, and you said that it was commonly perceived that he ran Manchester United with fear, but actually he tried to make his players be absolutely not afraid at all.
Yeah, so where a lot of my research on him came from was that I did a book a few years ago. I was asked by a publisher to do a book called How to Think Like Alex Ferguson. And it was to do with a more, it was, what they wanted was a more considered view on why he was successful.
Because I guess the lazy layman's approach is to think that everyone was just scared of him, so they tried really hard.
Yeah, it's like, the hairdryer is part of the lexicon, that he would shout at people and he'd scream at them from so close. It was like having your hair dried. And, he'd throw cups around the dressing room and intimidate them. And when I did the further analysis in terms of speaking to people around him, the words that came out were essentially about what a decent man he was, about his compassion, about his understanding and his empathy. So what I often say is that if you believe Ferguson was successful based on fear and intimidation, you'd have to believe that he is one of a few people that is somehow defying human psychology over the last 300,000 years. Because we know that we're wired not to respond to an environment of fear. We might deliver success occasionally, but that's like saying a broken clock is right. It's an accident. It's not a design. So you either believe that Ferguson was somehow defying 300,000 years of what we understand of human psychology, or our perception's faulty. And I think what I discovered in my analysis was it's our perception that's at fault if that's how we believe it. There's all kinds of stories about him in terms of just his innate decency to the players that were part of his setup. The fact that players talk about now that they can speak to him and he still inquires about their wives and their children's and their own parents and things like that. There's players that would undoubtedly run through brick walls for him. And you don't achieve that by frightening people.
But he's clearly a natural leader, and we've touched on leadership already, and I think it's another concept that's probably quite misunderstood amongst the average sports fan. Do you think that leadership, a bit like motivation, is inherent? Are you just, because we hear a lot about born leaders, do you think that is a true concept? Is that a real thing? Or can you teach anyone to lead? And as a second part to that question, how important do you feel that leadership is within a team?
It's a brilliant question. It's a brilliant series of questions, I suppose. I think I'm more in the camp that you can teach people to do it. And again, I'll use a sporting example. I've been in environments where I've gone into a team and I'm looking for the cultural architects. Who are the people that can lead, that can set the standard? And I remember going into one team where we agreed the behaviours, because first of all, you have to know what the standard of behaviours you're looking for. And then I got the players to vote. I said, give me your top 5 players that embody these behaviours. And there were 3 behaviours that we did. Now, some of them were very obvious. Some of them were the best players. Some of them were just very vocal and already you could recognise it. But the reason that challenged my perception was there was one guy that you would never in a million years have had there, because he was a lad that was very much seen as an outsider. He wasn't particularly popular, and I know that the club were looking at potentially selling him. And what came out of the analysis we did with the players was they said, we don't like him, but we respect him because he embodies the behaviours. And he went very much from being an outsider to being one of the cultural architects, one of the leaders within that team. So I think sometimes if people don't demonstrate those behaviours, it's often a result of either of the environment or the lack of clarity that's around it. So I think we all have the potential to do it as long as we're in an environment where the behaviours that are being requested of us are aligned with our own values. They're behaviours that we would do anyway. In terms of the importance of it, I'd go back to that stat I said in terms of from a coach's position. The research, the more detailed research suggests that a coach carries about 10% influence. I think a lot more of that influence is the leadership from within the playing group. So when you get a group of players that are prepared to stand up, and because you get what you tolerate, and if you get players that won't tolerate tardiness or players being selfish or players being unhelpful or snide to each other, when they don't tolerate it, that's where you know that it's starting to stick in a culture. I remember once I was working with it was a rugby league team where we took them away. We were doing like a team building exercise, and there was a canteen at lunchtime. And one of the coaches said to me, he said, go and stand near the end of the canteen. And he said, I want you to watch for who are the players that just fill up their plate with no regard for the queue behind them. That they don't know if there's enough food for everybody, but they're just greedy enough just to fill their own plate up. And he said, and see what happens. And what was interesting was there was a couple of players that did precisely that, just loaded the plates as high as they could. And when we knew we were onto something, their colleagues pulled them up on it and said, hey, that's not acceptable. There's 24 of us here. Wait and see if there's enough before you go back for seconds. And that's like the message sticks so much deeper then, because we know that we're pack animals by nature. As human beings, we hunt in packs. This is very much down to our conditioning. But you look at why we do it through religion, we do it today through Facebook, we do it through regional identities, we do it through our football teams. There's all different ways that we create our sense of identity. So if you want to be a member of a particular tribe, a team, a group, an organisation, and that group polices it and catches you in doing the behaviours as well as catches you out doing the unacceptable behaviours, you know that that's when you've got leadership happening in a really powerful culture.
Just going back slightly, when we talked about motivation, it seems as if there's one type of motivation, and that's the motivation to work hard, to care about the team, but there's only one strand of motivation. It seems like in leadership there are so many different types, but from what you're saying, is leadership by example the gold standard?
I think so, yeah. I think so in a commitment culture, I mean, there's 5 types of culture. So this isn't to suggest that what I'm talking about is the only way of doing it, because that'd be arrogant to suggest that, and it'd be incorrect as well. What the research says is there's effectively 5 different types of culture. So the first type of culture you can get is what we call a superstar culture. So in sporting terms, think of like Real Madrid when they had their Galacticos policy, where they just paid the highest money for the best players in the world. You throw them together and you hope that somehow the results are spectacular. And what we know is when it works brilliantly. When it goes wrong, it becomes equally spectacular in terms of how it goes wrong. The second cultural model is where you get an autocratic culture. And this is where you get one charismatic leader. And in organizations, it can be the head coach or it can be the founder or whatever. But you get an autocratic leader, a charismatic person that just sets the tone and says, this is the way we do it. And that's where there's a certain element of leading by example there. Another way you can do it is through bureaucracy, where you get a layer of middle management. It's very much about policing the environment. The fourth way is where you get an engineering culture, which is about problem solving and fixing things. But the fifth culture is what we've been talking about in this podcast, which is about a commitment culture. And that's where you say, like, these behaviours don't change. Whoever comes in, this is why we're doing it. And there's like a sense of purpose that is greater than any one individual. And all the research suggests that it's the commitment culture. And that's where leading by example comes into it. is the most sustainable and the most effective over the long term.
It's absolutely fascinating to listen to the ideas on culture, motivation, leadership. And I've heard you say elsewhere that 90% of problems that players have are mental rather than technical.
Yeah.
And when you look at world records falling and the standard of sport being played now, my belief is that we're not too far off the limits of human physiology.
Yeah.
What sort of gains do you think can be made in the mind, and how much could they improve performance?
Again, brilliant question, Charlie. I was working with a national team recently where I asked this to the players. So they were going off for a tournament, so I was only doing a little bit of work beforehand. And the question I asked them, I got all the players to stand up and I said, we're going to divide up your best performance into what we'll call hard and soft. So the hard skills are your fitness, your technical skills, things like that. The soft things are about cohesiveness, about confidence, about ability to communicate effectively. And I said, so what I want you to do is I want you to apportion your best performance and tell me how much of it was down to hard skills and how much of it was down to soft skills. So I said to them, sit down if 10% of it is down to soft skills. None of them moved. 20%. Still no one moved. 30, 40, 50. It was when we got to 60, a couple of them sat down. When we got to 70, the vast majority of them sat down. 80, there was a few more. There was a couple standing at 90. So what they were telling me was, on average in that group, 70% of their best performance was attributable down to soft skills that includes the mental side of the game. So my next question was, now let's have a look at where you spend most of your training week. How much of it is spent on soft skills? And the reality was it was less than 10%. So my point was, why would you expect to get significantly better than where you are at the moment? Because if you're telling me the hard skills accounts for 30% of it, and you're spending most of your time in the gym getting yourself, you get a little bit fitter, you get a little bit stronger, you get a little bit faster. But your big gains are going to come through the softer side of it. Why wouldn't you want to invest your time there? And I think what you see in high-performing cultures is that focus is starting to shift there, because that's where they're recognising some of these big gains can come about.
And I think it's something that everybody sees in their own sports team and the sports they watch. We've all seen players who's world beaters. The example that instantly springs to mind is Fernando Torres. He was at Liverpool. This is soccer for our American listeners. And he just looked unbeatable. And he went to Chelsea and he couldn't hit a barn door with a banjo. And there's nothing physical that's changed.
Yeah.
It's the same guy. And his head is gone. And yet you see it at the other end of the scale with Tom Brady, who now is still physically the worst quarterback ever measured in the history of the NFL draft, but simultaneously the greatest quarterback who's ever picked up a ball. And it just goes to show that the power of the mind, if you can harness it, is just so extraordinary. And as you say, they're only spending 10% of the time on it. Yeah,
I mean, this was, again, just part of my background is I'm often drawn back to boxing to look at examples like this. And one of my boxing heroes was Marvin Hagler. And like I say, I did the biography of him. And he was a guy that would tell you that he regards himself as, he wasn't the fastest, the toughest, the strongest, the fittest, or any of that. But somehow he's the longest reigning middleweight champion in boxing history. And a lot of it, he claims, was just down to his mental approach. So what he would do was, he said the only way he was going to do it was he had to be hungrier than his opposition. And so what he would do in terms of what that meant was, he would put himself into what he said was a self-chosen prison. And he would put himself in the training camp where he would ask the guy that ran the hotel to take the bed out of the room and any of the comforts, and he'd sleep in a mattress on the floor for 8 weeks. And the reason he would do that was almost what he said, it was mentally to make himself feel like he was making sacrifices that put him in a place that he knew he could dig deep. So I've worked with boxers where the point I make to them is, you don't rise to the moment. When you come under pressure, you descend to where you spend most of your time. So I'll give you an example. There was a young boxer I worked with years ago that he was always 5 minutes late for training. And he'd come in and he always had some smart quip to make and everybody would laugh and it'd get forgotten. And The one that always used to stick in my mind was he told me once that he said, I always do my road work, but I do my road work when I wake up. He would never set his alarm clock to run, but he would run when he woke up. And the long and short was, in his career, incredibly talented guy, he got to a world title fight. And in the world title fight, his first 6 rounds, he boxed his opponent's head off, just on technical skills alone. He was breathtaking. But he didn't put his opponent away. So in the last 6 rounds, forget skill now. It just became about your ability to dig deep, to find those reserves, to do things even when your body is screaming that it doesn't want to go there, that you can push yourself beyond those limits. And he'd never practiced it. He'd never got up when he was tired to run. He'd never sacrificed something to turn up early for the gym. So when it got to those last 6 rounds, he didn't have any reserves to call on. He had nothing in which mentally he could go to look at and find examples that could help him navigate his way through it. So he ended up holding on desperately for the last 6 rounds, and he ended up losing on points. And when he was crying in the dressing room, I wasn't so crass to make this point then. It was afterwards, but he was devastated. But the point we made to him over time was, you didn't lose that fight on the night of the fight. You lost it in the 5 years previously, when you've allowed your habits to get into these sloppy practices, because you found your level. When you came under pressure, you find your level where you spend most of your time. And when we talk about the likes of Brady or somebody like him, I don't know a lot about his background, but I guarantee his daily habits, his daily practices will be about discipline, about rigor, about doing that little bit extra, because that's what you see at the moments where he's under the greatest duress.
Damian, I know you're a busy man. You've got a train to catch, but that leads me on nicely to my final question. It's always good to try and relate this to the average athlete, the person in the street who's about to play their sport or might be out on a run now. What is the most common psychological flaw that you see in athletes, and what's the fix for it?
I wouldn't limit this to athletes, but I would say, I think for a lot of us, we get fixed in a certain mindset. So Edward de Bono, the creativity guru, talks about solid thinking, the idea that we've got a view of how the world should be, how things should play out, what should be the case. So when you find people saying it's not fair, because what they're actually saying is, my view of the world isn't being respected. And I think we can get too fixed in our view of the world. And I think what I find can often happen is, when things don't go our way, then it's that we get stuck almost. So what I'd encourage anybody to listen to this is, just have the ability to be fluid in the way that you see it, to have that ability to go back and keep challenging your view of the world, because that's where the real power lies, that there might be a better way. It's about the increments. It's about doing small things differently. You know, I know that I'm not a big fan of that phrase, marginal gains. I think it's been hackneyed to the point of a cliche, but the point behind it holds. It's about the ability to go back and just challenge, often our own thinking, and see things in a slightly different way. And I think any of us can do that. And I think anyone that's good enough to listen to this podcast and any of the other in the series that you've got with some of the really fascinating people, they're already opening themselves up to the idea that, let's listen to something different. So I don't think this is necessarily as applicable to your listeners as it might be to others that just think they know it all, they've got the answers. It's almost having that humility to accept that none of us have the answers, but we can all open ourselves up to listen to a different viewpoint. I sometimes use an example with some of the players that I tell them a story I read years ago about Jimi Hendrix. And it's a guy called Andrew Oldham, who at the time was the Rolling Stones manager, tells it. He says he went to a club in New York with Jimi Hendrix to go and see a guitarist. And he said the first couple of minutes it became obvious this guitarist was hopeless. And this Andrew Oldham said to Jimi Hendrix, he said, come on, let's go, we'll go for a night out. And Jimi Hendrix said, no chance. He said, I'm staying to watch him. And Andrew Oldham said, well, what are you going to learn off this guy? He's rubbish. And Jimi Hendrix said, yeah, he is. He said, but he's that bad. He might do something that nobody else expects. And I want to be here to learn off it. And it's almost that idea that we can learn from any environment, we can learn from anything, if we have that fluidity in our thinking, rather than just being fixed and rigid.
Well, Damien, I feel like I've learned so much in the last 50 minutes or so. It's overwhelming. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners as well.
Thank you very much for your time. And it would be great to speak in the future, because I suspect we'll have one or two questions flying in after this interview.
Oh, I'd love to, yeah. If anyone wants to get in touch, either do it for yourself or I'm on Twitter at Liquid Thinker, where I pick it up as regular as I can in terms of responding. But it's a real pleasure to be on it. I think it's a brilliant programme that you're doing.
Thank you very much. Massive thanks to Damian for his time, and if you want to find out more about him and his work, check out his website, www.liquidthinker.com. Follow him on Twitter at liquidthinker, or best of all, buy one of his superb books. Speaking of which, Damian has kindly donated a copy of his book, How to Think Like Sir Alex Ferguson, and a copy of The 5 Steps to a Winning Mindset. If you want to win one of the books, tag us on Instagram using the hashtag winningmentalitypodcast, and we'll pick 2 winners at random from the photos that get tagged. This interview is just one part of a big project, and I can promise you now that this weekly podcast will always be free to listen to. You're never going to be charged to hear these interviews. However, if we're going to build this into something big and continue to attract top sports people to this podcast, we need your help. Big numbers of listeners and positive reviews help give the podcast credibility and make it appealing for guests to come on. So subscribe, share, comment, tell your friends about what we're doing, and help spread the word. The more listeners and subscribers we have, the more guests will want to appear on the show, and the more interviews we can produce for you. We love sport and the stories behind it, and we know you do too, so help us build this, and we promise you a weekly dose of high-quality sporting conversation in return. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week.